Kia ora koutou katoa, ko John Reid taku ingoa. Welcome to this edition of Water New Zealand's podcast series, Tāwara o Te Wai. I'm John Reid from Water New Zealand, and co-hosting this podcast with me today is Emily Afoa. Now, it probably won't surprise many people that flooding is becoming a big risk across many parts of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And in a lot of places, it's hitting more often and with more impact. For many of us, it's really becoming a case of when, not if, we'll experience flooding.
Our floodplains are things that will happen. When they do happen, there will be insurance losses and you will lose some things that you love. And I would like to see that shift in our language.
Today, we're talking flood risk, what it means in practice, how it's changing, and how to help people prepare for the inevitable. To discuss this today, we're joined by Nancy Baines, Principal for Flood Risk at Auckland Council, and Nick Brown, Head of Intelligence and Flood Resilience in the Council's Healthy Waters team. So how do we help people really understand their level of risk? And how do we make sure communities are prepared and know how to keep themselves, their whānau, and their homes safe? Kia ora, Nancy and Nick. Great to have you with us. Emily, over to you.
Tēnā koroa. We like to set the context in these podcasts in our Tāwara o Te Wai kōrero. So thinking back, there's been a lot about flood risk in the headlines recently, even just considering the events we've experienced this year in 2026. Perhaps starting with you, Nancy, what are you seeing from your roles over the last few years?
If I put myself back just a few years, even I think the 2023 floods are a real big turning point for our community. If I put myself back into the shoes, late 2022, people saw some flood maps, but they didn't believe them necessarily. And I think now, having experienced not just the Auckland anniversary event and Cyclone Gabrielle, but of course all the other events that we've had since then, it's definitely now a much bigger priority on people's minds. And I know that the conversations that I'm having with the community are so much more in depth now, which is incredible. I can talk to people about flood modelling, I can talk to them about emergency plans, and we can have a really detailed and important discussion. So it's definitely been the biggest change for me, I think. It's just the general appetite for flooding information and the level of knowledge out there is going through the roof. Yeah. What have you seen, Nick?
I suppose I feel relieved. I feel like I spent decades trying to tell people about flooding, and now suddenly people are interested in it. And they're looking at it and they're engaged and they want to know more and they're seeking out the information and asking us or engaging with us to say, well, what more can you tell us? How can we help ourselves? All those things we've been wanting to talk about, but perhaps haven't had the audience before now.
Does that have a tangible impact on how you're both able to do your job, having the community asking these questions rather than going out and trying to drum up interest in the nature of our work?
Absolutely. So kind of almost being more united with the direction that we want council to be going in with, united with the community. They're talking to their politicians about flooding. We're talking to their politicians about flooding. And we have that really clear remit about what the community want from us right now. And that gives us a really easy path to follow in that sense.
I guess there's a lot of the nuance that people don't understand about flooding, which we've now got an opportunity to tell them. Like prior to the floods, no one really appreciated that floodwaters were contaminated. Pretty much 100% of the time they're going to be contaminated with wastewater. I think it was curious the interplay between flooding and insurance sitting within there. That most people's insurance will include an accommodation allowance when you are flooded if you have to be out of your home. But in the Auckland market, that typically covers something like about a six-month period. And what homeowners found was that sometimes the refurbishment took up to 8 months. And so the accommodation supplement ran out after 6 months. And, they're sitting there at 8 months. That was a net drain they didn't expect to have. Fascinating, really, to see that there is guidance out there on how to dry your house, but how often is it followed? Brands has got great guidance. If you look through that guidance, you look and think, oh, really? Is that what you have to do? You're actually meant to crack a weatherboard on the outside and get some airflow going through. And so those houses that have been flooded multiple times, once your house is put back together and looks all nice again, you don't know what's in behind the walls. But if the house hasn't been dried properly, once you open up that wall, and this was the case in a number of houses in Westport, you had a lot of mold on the inside of those walls. So it's a critical thing that people believe that a couple of dehumidifiers for a couple of days will do the job, and it can be inadequate.
I think a lot of people aren't suspecting the time that you have to prepare. People think, oh, we'll get a text, we'll know when we need to leave. But actually, the time you realise it's flooding, the water will already be there. Particularly in Auckland, we have really quick response times, and I don't think people are necessarily thinking about that right now. And that's something we, definitely trying to be talking about. You think you'll have time to move your photographs, you think you'll have time to put your laptops and your TV up high, but actually do that ahead of time. Otherwise, it'll be too quick.
Just heartbreaking, right? Those stories, like the other week you had Wellington, and that poor guy going back through his house, and all his commentary. I mean, he's a great storyteller. That poor guy was in his house, it had been flooded, and they said, "Oh, what happened?" And he said, "I woke up, there was a sound of water." And I'm paraphrasing because I just watched this once a few weeks ago, but I got up, heard water running. I stood on the toilet seat and looked out the window of the bathroom. I saw water running down the outside. I thought I'd better go move my plants. I got to the front door, water was running past there. So I went back into the house and said, "Right, family, let's go." On the way out of the house, I threw a photo album, some photo albums on the bed, and these were hard copy photos that he only had there. On the way out the house, the fridge fell over, and so someone in the family had to hold that up, and so younger members of the family could scoot underneath it to outside. He got outside and he had the car keys in his hand, and he's like, "Okay, so the car's a no-go, there's too much water around, so I can't do that." And so as soon as he got his family to safety, he then started knocking on all the other doors around him. And so you could look at that dispassionately and say, hey, your house was in a floodplain, which this person's may or may not have been, but your house is in a floodplain. You should know how high your floor level is, whether you're likely to flood or not, and know that you're safe to stay inside your house. But that's not how humans behave, and it's entirely rational that they don't behave that way, because we use the entirety of our properties, not just sit within there. And so because those people were then woken up, they were then interacting with floodwaters.
That's so human. Nick only heard that once and he remembers it because it really could be any of us. And we think we're going to make really logical decisions when we're in a dangerous situation, but we might not. It really depends, where the people we care about are, the things that we care about. And yeah, that situation could really be any of us.
And that's what I think we need to remember. It's where our houses are. It's the hazards that we're exposed to. By the time we are living there, it is too late. There are decisions that we need to make ahead of time. Any of us could have been in that position if we didn't work in this industry and know the flooding information and where to go and find it.
How do we best enable people to find that information they need to make decisions?
We've had really good information for a long time, and published that information. I mean, flood hazard information in Auckland's been produced, probably goes back about 40 years. And it's improved across all that time. After Auckland Council formed, we ended up with all of the flood hazard information being publicly available, but it was publicly available in something that we call geomaps, and that can be a little bit tricky to use. And so directly after the 2023 floods, that was recognised by us.
Yeah, so that's when we published the flood viewer in August of 2023, and what was the real step change is you can now get the flood risk information on your phone, which is so much easier. You can be looking at a property or looking at your house and you can just tap your location, it takes you straight to where you are. Not only does it show you if there's a flood layer around or flood risk area, but it tells you what that actually means. What is this blue blob that my house is in? And then really importantly, what we can do about it, because we don't want people finding out they're exposed to flooding and then leaving them to it. We want people to feel empowered to actually take action. We've been talking so much about that ahead of time piece. So that's why we launched the flood viewer, and of course other councils have their flooding information online as well. But just online is great, but also how do you get to people who aren't necessarily using their phones? And word of mouth is really good. If you can have one community leader who is really good with their technology, they can be then passing on the information they're seeing on Flood Viewer to others as well. So we do try and make sure we kind of get and work with the communities in different ways as well, whether it be information stalls or community leaders, etc.
And in local government land, we've kind of discharged our responsibility to disclose information via LIMS, Land Information Memoranda. And I guess our acknowledgement was that about half of our community will never own their own home and will spend their life renting, so we'll never come across that kind of information. And so really wanted to make it accessible to people in their pockets through their mobile phones. And so Nancy, some of those comments that we were getting back from people that were looking to rent and buy, right, and talking about now what they did in their search for a house, whether they're looking to own or to buy.
But, we've had people who have experienced flooding, and so they have that fear of, is this going to happen to me again? And now, having that information much more quickly and freely available, they can say, actually, no, I don't want to live in an area exposed to flooding, and they can now feel more safe when they hear the rain and things like that, because they know their risk. And hearing something like that is just incredibly, rewarding. I'm so glad that we could get this information out in a way that people could understand, easy to access, and give them that peace of mind.
We kind of didn't just stop there. We thought, we'll apply the open data standards and Creative Commons license and make the information accessible such that others can ingest it. And so, years ago, that would have really worried me, putting our data available publicly because the only thing people could do years ago was to download it, have a replica of it that would then immediately start dating. Now they can create a pipeline through to our data such that when we update our information, it updates through into their system. And so Nancy, you had some of that success with external websites.
Yeah, so websites like Trade Me and OneRoof have put the flooding risk on their property listings, like their rental and their to buy, which is great, because also they're only going to do that if that's something their customers are asking for. So it shows, again, that Aucklanders, New Zealanders, they really want this information, and pushing enough that companies like Trade Me and OneRoof are willing to put it on their websites. I think that's, again, something I just never would have thought of happening, 4 years ago. It just really shows the rate of change that we've had since then.
But beyond the maps is such a lovely thing. Like the videos that are in there, what to do before, during, and after a flood event, how to make your home more flood resilient, and also linked through their FAQs. And so, Nancy particularly has worked quite hard on those to get those to a state where, all of your curiosities are kind of answered there if you get in and need to understand what's going on.
Nick's being very humble. He worked very hard on those as well. But that's what the Flavio offers, kind of that further step than Trade Me or OneRoof, is it has all of that supporting information, all that collateral, and that's just being updated all the time as well. So, for example, renters, we know there's a really big need there. We need to work on collateral specifically for renters. It will go straight up onto that media library.
It's powerful, and it's showing that so much of this comes down to how we engage with people. And what it sounds like from the kōrero you've been sharing, from the request for information, we are getting a massive step change in flood literacy in our communities. Do you have areas that you can give us teasers on that you're working on to improve that further, or a wish list that if people in the community were asking for more, what would you want to be able to produce to help grow flood literacy? Because there's still an element here if people are going to search for the information, like are we infiltrating schools, or what are we doing here to grow our literacy even further?
It's everyone in Auckland who's our target audience. Any person can come across floodwaters. We need to target everyone because it's usually about people's behaviours in floodwaters that causes the risk or the problem. But Nancy spent a lot of time thinking about our different audiences and how to reach them.
Some key audiences we're particularly working on at the moment is, like we just said, renters. We know that that's a bit of a gap, so we've done research into trying to understand how do renters, property managers, landlords interact with our information. Do they just actively disclose flood risk information? If they do they provide guidance? No prizes for guessing the answer. There's definitely a responsibility action gap. Both the property managers and the tenants think that the landlord will disclose, when the landlord thinks that the tenant will look out that information themselves. There is willing in the landlord's community particularly, but how can we make that easier? How can we make that actually happen? It's one thing being willing, but actually taking that action is the next step. So building up a work program at the moment to try and improve that engagement and outcomes for renters. We're also looking and researching property flood resilience and how that can work for our context. It's used all over the rest of the world, but how can we translate that to our flooding, our buildings, our regulations? So we're partnering with Brands and Natural Hazard Commission for that, because it really is a collaborative effort which we can all learn from. So those are a couple of big things that are on the cards at the moment, which are quite interesting, and I'm really hoping that are going to get some real momentum and on the ground improvements for communities. Yeah, for sure.
I know when I was working in the UK in this space that there was a lot more around how do you make, how do you become more resilient to flooding from, just being able to recover more quickly. And there was a lot more guidance and being shared around that sort of area. I don't know if there's anything more you'd like to share there about just some simple things that people can do in that recovery space.
I think it's handy to understand why you flood and what causes your flooding. And perhaps fully half of all the flooding is water that could have gone around your house that for one reason or another got into your home. And so, if it's from overland flow, your job is to try and make the water get around your house without getting into your home or to your garage, really, and without impacting anything else along the way. So, heat pumps are commonly at ground level, but if the overland flow is going to come through there, it's going to ride off your heat pump. If your floor level for your house is ever the same as the ground level around the house, you've got a problem. All houses are built above ground level. If the ground level is the same as the inside of your house, it means the ground level's been raised and shouldn't have been. It's kind of that simple. And so the more steps you've got up into your house, the more resilient your home is likely to be, unless you've done something like build a solid fence on the downstream boundary that water can pond in behind. I mean, again, back in the Auckland anniversary event, I got out to one site and it had been flooded to 0.5 metre inside the house. The water had built up against the fence to 1 metre high, and then the fence had collapsed. If that fence hadn't been there, or if it had been built in such a way that it allowed flow to pass through with the appropriate gaps, that house wouldn't have flooded at all. So it was built fine. It was a subsequent landscaping decision, and we see that all the time, like conservatories jutting out, stopping the flow of water, planter boxes coming in, contouring, like people wanting their driveway to flow nicely down to their front door, and then concreting that, and that's kind of just a hydroslide from water straight into their front door at that point. Wasn't on the original plans, but was subsequently done. So all sorts of these ways that water finds its way into the house that it really just doesn't need to, and usually it's always harder afterwards to take those things back out again, but definitely worthwhile to do so.
We saw that same thing out on the ground, kind of helping record some of the impacts and share that information back into council. And so many instances that I saw were solid fences, but what was hard is going back out and seeing people replace like with like, because they'd got their insurance payout and they were building back just the same. And I think that's a real nature of the literacy piece now moving forward, to understand that like for like is not the right solution there, because then if you flood again, you're building another dam.
I often think back to, as an example, for seatbelts. Like, how long ago was it that people didn't wear seatbelts at all? And now we don't even think about it. When you're getting in a car, you do your seatbelt up without even thinking. And it's the same as flooding, right? It's like a low likelihood but high consequence event, a car crash, but you were doing that safety measure every single time without even thinking about it. So I think change can happen. I think the way we're moving is really good, and I'm feeling hopeful.
I've been excited to listen to these stories and your reflections and change and growth, the work that you've been doing through Auckland Council. So I'm really interested to hear, how are you sharing or are you sharing the lessons learned with other councils across the nation, or have you been learning from other councils? Because I know this is a national, international, global problem. How's that knowledge exchange or collaboration working?
Certainly everything we do, we want it to be picked up by others. And so everything that we do in design, happy for others to ask for it, to take it, to put their logos on it. The messaging's the same for the whole community. They need to be able to lift it up. As part of the recovery work that Nancy and I and you, Emily, and many others across Auckland were involved in. That recovery office is due to wind up over the next month or so, and they've been working on their lessons learned documents and saying what are the top level things that people need to know and how we're going to share this to the different levels of decision makers across the country. But you're very conscious with anything that we've produced, right down to the videos that Nancy's done, is so that others can take them and use them for their purposes. But Nancy, you're probably better to talk to that in terms of NEMA and messaging and consistency and emergency management.
Yeah, so Nick's talking about the videos that we have on the Flood Viewer, and we make sure that they use the NEMA, so National Emergency Management Agency's consistent messaging, so that anyone can pick them up and use them. We also co-branded them with Auckland Emergency Management so that, again, they could be picked up and reused. And we are willing to share. If anyone wants them, please do get in touch.
I just wanted to also ask about how you feel the public are understanding sort of the flood risk that you're publicising in your engagement with them. Are they actually picking up and able to act on it? Is there anything you wanted to share in that sort of area?
It probably goes back to human belief and what people do and don't believe will happen to them in human nature, that we probably believe that positive things will come our way and negative things are unlikely. But I think Nancy's got a great analogy for this one.
Yeah, so one thing, is that 1% storm that we're always talking about in the industry. But what does that actually mean for someone who's looking at a house? This one's got a really nice kitchen. It's like rent I can afford. And it's just a 1% floodplain. What does that actually mean? But of course, that's just what we're showing. Areas within that are going to flood more frequently, and areas outside of that might flood when there is a larger event. And there's always going to be a bigger storm. So I like to say when I'm like, this is the floodplain with the 1% AEP. And what I mean by that is, imagine a roulette wheel. And it has 100 little sections. And one of those sections is this floodplain. And every year you're spinning that wheel. So say you live there for, the length of a mortgage, for like 30 years, you're spinning that wheel 30 times. And if you're living there your whole life, you're hopefully spinning that 70, 80 times. And then think of how those odds feel different to you now.
And also with, the 1% floodplain within that has got the flooding that occurs more frequently. We've got some houses that are within a 10% floodplain. And so imagine that you've got the wheel and it's got 10 slots on it. And if you live there for 10 years, then, these our floodplains are things that will happen. When they do happen, there will be insurance losses and you will lose some things that you love. If the water gets into the house, you will lose some things that you love. You will likely experience some trauma. There will be risk to yourself. You may or may not get injured. You will likely get sick because you will have been handling contaminated things. These are all wills, not mights or maybes. It is happening to somebody if the property exists in that location. And I would like to see that shift in our language. I think it's interesting to look at and go, people don't believe things that you predict will happen, but they do believe things that have happened. And so done some work looking at, well, what events have hit the Auckland region? And so went back to 1861 and looked through all the media articles from then till now and said, what events have happened? And it was curious for me. I've lived in the same kind of place for about 20 years now. And it was interesting. I had a look at one of the events that occurred near me, and I thought, okay, I wonder if I know about that event. Clicked on it, and it was tornado in 1982 that destroyed 5 houses and damaged 80 others. So 20 years before I started living there, I had not a clue that the tornado had come up. It felt like tornadoes were recent things when the Albany tornado happened, whatever year that was, 2011 or something. And that felt like a new thing then. But it's interesting to go through your own history and think, what short memories we have and what fallible memories we have. So yeah, looking at doing some more of that kind of work to make that information available to the community so people can see. And some of those articles, and some of them are quite hard case, aren't they, Nancy? Like the floodwaters that's got the horse and trap stuck in the middle of the floodwaters, and it's still in no area of Auckland that flooded. And you're going back, over 100 years to that photo. So trying to cut things from both ends. Here's what will happen. Here's what has happened. We are living with flooding. Do you know what to expect, and do you know what to do?
Yeah, those baselines that we live our lives by are heavily weighted to the recent past.
Trying to get more information out there all the time, right? And so we put out there on GeoMaps flood hazards, and so they are relatively poisonous looking colours. They go from yellow through orange through red through purple, and those colours reflect people's experiences of the flooding. People were quite shocked that relatively shallow water that was fast flowing was difficult to walk through or could knock them off their feet. The people whose cars floated, 300 mils of water to float a car, unless you've got a lower depth and a higher velocity, or if you've got more of an SUV style car, maybe up to 500 millimeters. That's the kind of the maximum before it starts floating. It can float at less than that, and you lose traction. And we had all the flooding in Valencia, and a lot of people got into their cars and died because of that decision. So that even that messaging. If you have to evacuate because you're in the wrong location during floodwaters and you can't stay somewhere safe, then do it on foot. Don't try and do it in the car.
I think that's a stark piece of advice, Nick, but very, very meaningful, because I remember when I first saw a chart talking about where cars would float, it astounded me. But we've seen it in practice all around the world. I think I'd like to transition to the way we frame our thinking as we start to wrap up. We have levers available for change. What are some levers in your minds that we can use to make a positive change beyond what's already out there?
Interesting question, particularly with the changes either to local water done well or local government reform and staring down the barrel of having many unitary councils across the country. And so I'm having conversations with colleagues around the place, and they're saying, well, what is the role? It's like, well, the primary role has to be as asset owner operator and maintaining what you own. That's everyone's got to do that, right? That's the starting point. And then from there, a lot of people will jump to, well, what are you going to build to reduce the flood risk? But I don't think that's the right question. I think the next right question is, are your planning rules and provisions, are they set at the right place? Can you stop the problem getting worse? And in this case, we're talking about flooding, but we could be talking about water quality or anything else. So are the planning rules and provisions set right such that things are getting no worse? If they are, then someone might say, okay, let's start building stuff to make it better. That's still the wrong thing to do, because if we building stuff takes you decades to do, right? It's a really long, slow burn. And so what do we know? If we know we've got a problem, so what's the one thing you should do to mitigate that risk? It's tell people about it. Okay. Do people know? Do they know how they could behave or what they could do to reduce their risk and the impacts on their lives and themselves and their families? Okay. So that's the third thing that we do. The fourth thing that we do is, okay, what does our investment look like for the locations in which you can build your way out of some of these issues? I think it was really useful in 2023 that we got to the point where the government subsidised some kind of buyback. Prior to that, buyback was not really on the cards for councils, and so many of the things that we would look to build would cost more than the value of the private homes that we're looking to help with that. And so at least brings in that economic rationality into it. That's the building side. That was the fourth one. The fifth one is it's really informing others' resilient spend. And so the communication piece that we've talked a lot about today, that's about all those private assets and trying to get those better. But what about those assets owned by institutions? And so, how can we, as a provider of natural hazard information, provide that in such a way that it's understood and used for people like Transpower, for Ministry of Education, for Ministry of Health with our hospitals, for NZTA with the National Roading Network, for social housing providers. So all of these organisations are spending, a lot of money. If you look at the amount of money council spends compared to the total infrastructure spend in Auckland, the total infrastructure spend dwarfs the amount that councils will spend in any given area, but it's councils are the ones that hold the information. And so it's really putting more effort into making sure that information is available, consumable, actionable by those other people who are spending money anyway, such that we get to a more resilient society in future.
Thank you, Nancy and Nick, for joining Emily and myself today. It was great to talk to you about approaches to improving flood risk and the outcomes this might lead to. Thank you for listening to this latest episode. We'll be back soon with another episode.